The reading this morning is from Mark chapter 5, verse 20. Is it 20? 21. Yep. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subjected to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he had put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat.
Good morning. Welcome to church from me. Welcome especially if you don't know me. My name's David, as Hamish has said, after David has just read the Bible, and with David sitting over here. So if your name's not David, you're still welcome. I'm the minister here, and it's my pleasure to help us understand what God is saying in this little pair of stories that have been read to us as we continue thinking about more than you can imagine today, life. What is life? What does it mean to be alive? Now, we all know that there's a difference between being alive and having a life. You know what we say when someone's being frustrating and annoying. We say, "Get a life." Life's about so much more than just breathing, than just having a pulse. A tree is alive, but is that the kind of life you want? Coral is alive, but is that living? And we all feel, don't we, from time to time, or maybe even most of the time for some of us, we feel that we are not really living, that we are only just alive. And it's hard to put our finger on what's wrong, why we're not satisfied, why we're always tired, why we're never content. Our life is frustrating more than fulfilling. Our life is missing something, but we don't know what. Everything we try doesn't really work. Our life isn't what it could or should be. See, what is life? What is the true, the good, the rewarding, the fulfilling, the best possible life? Does it even exist, or is it just a dream? And if it does exist, where can we get it? Well, friends, I've got great news for you today, and that is that real life, true life, full life, the best life, it does exist. And even more, it's available to anyone who wants it. What am I talking about? Well, come with me to the story of Jesus we just heard read to us, because the answer is there. It's the story of a couple of amazing miracles that Jesus performed, which are part of a whole collection of amazing miracles. When Jesus demonstrated his power over nature by calming a deadly storm at sea, and he demonstrated his power over evil by rescuing a man from demon possession. And here in our stories today, his power over sickness in healing the woman, his power over death in raising Jairus' daughter. It's an amazing set of miracles. But I want us to focus on these last two miracles in particular, because they kind of go together as a pair, and together they show us where true life is found and how to get it. And the stories start with Jesus at the height of his popularity. Insanely popular. Everyone wants to hear him, everyone wants to see him, everyone wants to be with him. I mean, he's only just stepped off the boat after returning from the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and there's already a great scrum of people waiting for him. It's a long way around the lake, and they'd seen Jesus sail off for the other side a day or two before, and so they must have been watching for him to return. And when they spotted him, the word got around, and people came from everywhere, so that Mark says when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, that is where the people were, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. He'd barely set foot off the boat, and he was mobbed. And in this large crowd, hurrying over to see Jesus, but with a much more urgent and significant purpose than the rest, are two people. We meet the first one in verse 22. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. Now, Jairus is an important man. He's a well-known, highly respected man in his community. He's a leader in the local synagogue. And yet when he comes to Jesus, what does he do? It says he fell at Jesus' feet, a position of utter humility, the position of a lowly slave. But he doesn't care that he's degrading himself like this. The crowds are asking themselves, what on earth is Jairus doing here? Because he has something much more important, desperately more important than keeping up appearances for the crowd. Mark writes, he pleaded earnestly with Jesus, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." His little daughter dying. In fact, it's even more serious than that, because he literally says, "My little daughter has reached the end." In other words, she is at death's door. And if Jesus doesn't come right now, it'll be too late. No one else can help her. Only Jesus can, and only if he comes straight away. And so, without hesitation, Mark says so, Jesus went with him. But there's a problem. And that problem is the crowds. It says a large crowd followed and pressed around Jesus. I don't know if you've ever been in a large crowd, a pressing large crowd. I hear that if you're on the Sydney Harbour foreshore for the New Year's Eve fireworks, the crowd can be like that. So many people, impossible to move anywhere at more than a snail's pace. And Jesus needs to get to Jairus' house, and he needs to get there immediately, but there's a crowd. And unbeknownst to Jesus, in the pressing crowd, there is someone else, the second person that day who is desperate to meet Jesus. But she is a person who is at the other end of the social scale from Jairus. Jairus and she, notice she doesn't even get a name in the story. Jairus and she couldn't be more different. Mark says, a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, a woman with a 12 years with uncontrolled hemorrhaging. Now, in itself, that would be bad enough, wouldn't it? That would be terrible. But in Israel, in Jesus' time, it was even worse. Because the old laws God had given to his people way back in the time of Moses, 1,500 years before Jesus, those venerable, old, unchanging traditions said that a woman who was bleeding was ritually and spiritually unclean until such time as the bleeding stopped. Ritually and spiritually unclean. You know what that means? It means that she was, for the whole time she was bleeding, she was a social pariah and outcast. So you see why the woman and Jairus are at opposite ends of the social scale. Because while Jairus was local citizen number one, leader in the synagogue, anyone who was unclean had to separate themselves from the community. They had to isolate themselves until their uncleanness went away, which meant also being cut off from access to God, to no synagogue worship, no temple ceremonies. Jairus was a synagogue leader. This woman couldn't even put a foot inside the synagogue door. She was a pariah, cut off, isolated, unclean before God and humankind. And it was even worse. Because if she didn't isolate herself, and if she came into contact with anyone else, if she even touched them, then that person would become unclean like her. And you can imagine how unpopular that would make the woman. But here she is in a crowd, in a pressing crowd. She is touching everyone. Such a huge risk. I remember back in COVID time, if you were out at the shops and you accidentally coughed, how everyone looked at you. Well, multiply that 1,000 times over, and that's how the crowds would be glaring at her, or worse, if they only knew what she was. But she doesn't care. She is desperate. Because not only is she unclean, not only has she been unclean, an outcast for 12 years, Mark says that during those 12 years she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Unclean, an outcast, now also impoverished and broke, and suffering worse than ever. No wonder she's desperate to see Jesus. No one has been able to help her. Maybe Jesus can. Except that, well, even though she is so desperate, she is still unsure. Because, of course, to actually see Jesus, to front up to him and ask him directly for help, well, how could she do that? Because, I mean, to ask Jesus for help publicly in the middle of that crowd, well, it means explaining publicly her situation, confessing publicly her shame. confessing to the crowd and to Jesus, the great teacher himself, that she, 12 years unclean, has touched them all. So she decides to approach Jesus quietly, subtly, so that no one will notice. Mark writes, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And you know what? It works. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. The bleeding stopped, the suffering over, her uncleanness gone. How good is that? She was only moments before a woman alive, but with no life to speak of. The living dead. But now she can go away and she can live again. What a perfect plan. What a perfect outcome. Well, except for one big, unexpected snag. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. She thought she could do it without anyone noticing, but Jesus noticed. And even worse, Jesus decided to make a big deal of it. He turned around in the crowd and he asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Jesus, what are you doing? Don't stop now. Don't you have to get to Jairus' house like yesterday? Can't you just ignore it? Ignore me and move on? And of course, it's not like it's going to be easy to answer Jesus' question, is it? His disciples point out what's obvious. You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you can ask, who touched me? What do you mean, who touched you, Jesus? Everyone's touched you. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Jesus is not going to be dissuaded. And of course, the longer he takes over this, the greater the chance that Jairus' little girl is going to die. If only Jesus wouldn't be so stubborn. And so the woman realizes that there's no point in hiding any longer. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, the same posture as Jairus earlier. But not out of humility and respect for Jesus. But Mark writes, trembling with fear, she told him the whole truth. What will Jesus think? What will the crowds think? What will happen to her now? But Jesus shocks everyone. He's not angry. He's not irate. But he speaks to her with deep compassion and love. He says, daughter. Daughter. Not outcast, not reprobate, not careless fool, but daughter. Your faith has healed you. No, actually, literally, he says, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. See, why was Jesus being so stubborn? Why interrupt? Why jeopardize his life and death errand for Jairus? Well, because simply healing this woman was never going to be enough for Jesus. Now, having healed her, Jesus also wants to save her. Daughter, go in peace. Don't just slink away anonymously like a kid who's stolen a lolly from the shop counter. But go in peace, go in wholeness, go with the rich blessing of a beautifully restored relationship with God and his people. Go in peace and be freed, be made whole from your suffering. Not just your physical suffering, but from all of your suffering, social, relational, spiritual. Come home, daughter. Return to the family of God. Come home and live, really, truly live. It's a beautiful moment, isn't it? What incredible generosity and kindness and grace to give this woman, this nobody, hopeless, nameless reject, such dignity, such honour, such joy. But, and here's the thing, is that something Jesus can actually do? Is that something Jesus is equipped and authorized to offer? I mean, sure, Jesus is impressive. He can perform amazing miracles. Here's a whole series that in this part of Mark's gospel, he can heal people. He healed her. But to give her not just healing, but life, total peace and joy and hope and reconciliation with God. In other words, to not only heal her, but to save her. Can Jesus really do that? Is he equipped for that? Well, at that moment, Mark says, while Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the home of Jairus, the synagogue leader. And they came with the worst possible news, the news that no father ever wants to hear. Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? Jesus, in his enthusiasm to save this nobody woman's life, has destroyed honourable Jairus's. Why bother the teacher anymore, say his servants? What can he possibly do now? But Jesus, says Mark, ignores them, and he turns to Jairus and he says, don't be afraid, just believe. See, there are two possible responses for Jairus to his situation here. There is fear, the fear of death, of grief, of losing everything. Or there is faith, believing in, trusting in the one who claims that he can save. Don't be afraid, says Jesus, just believe. And so now, finally, Jesus leaves the crowd behind him. He didn't let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and he said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child isn't dead, but asleep. What's that? Is Jesus confused here? Does he not know what's going on? Well, not at all. He knows full well what's going on. In fact, by choosing to stop and save the bleeding woman, Jesus was, in fact, making sure that he would get to the house too late. Remember what Jairus had first told Jesus, my little daughter has reached the end. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be saved and live. Jesus knew that time was of the essence, that if he hurried away immediately, it would still be touch and go as to whether he would reach her on time. And so he stopped. And he waited until he knew that she would be dead. But if Jesus can indeed save as he claims he can, then what is even death to him? In his presence, death is no more an obstacle to life than a solid night's sleep. I'm here, says Jesus to the weeping mourners, and in front of me, death is not the final hopeless end. No one is irretrievably dead. Since I'm here, don't think that she's dead, but she's just sleeping because I have the power to save. I have the power of life. But the mourners don't believe it. They refuse to believe it. How ridiculous an idea that this teacher could do that. And so Mark says they laughed at him. But then after Jesus put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and he went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and he said to her in Aramaic, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And immediately the girl rose up and began to walk around. Because, well, who'd have thought it? Because she was 12 years old. 12 years old. The woman, remember, 12 years bleeding, a living death. This little girl, 12 years of hope-filled life, cut short by death. And Jesus saves them both. The girl's parents, it says, were completely astonished. They were out of their minds amazed. What had they just seen? What had Jesus just done? Because you see, Jesus can save. Jesus can give life. It is unbelievable, but it is true. What he said to the poor woman healed of her bleeding, he was able to say, he was equipped to say, he had the full authority to say, because he can do it. He has the power to do it. He has the power to save, the power to give real life. Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be made whole from your suffering. And friends, God sent his son Jesus into the world to hold out this same offer to everyone. You can be saved. You can have life. Not just biological life, not just your lungs still breathing and your heart still pounding, but real life, true life, full life, the best possible life. A life with no frustration or shame, no discontent, nothing missing. The woman's experience is just a picture, it's a faint glimpse of the reality that Jesus promises to everyone who lets go of their fear and just believes. Adoption as a son or daughter of God, a child in his family, reconciled perfectly and at peace with him, and enjoying his life in complete wholeness, finally freed from all suffering. This is real life. This is true life. It's what the Bible calls eternal life. And not meaning, this pale imitation of life that we endure here and now, set on endless repeat. What a terrible thing that'd be. Like a never-ending bad dream. No, but meaning the life of eternity, the life of God's limitless and inexhaustible depth and richness and joy. More than you can possibly imagine. This is the life that Jesus offers. This is the life that Jesus is fully and completely equipped to give. And it's the life that we receive when we throw off our fear and simply believe and trust ourselves, our lives, our joys, our future into the power and the rule of the one who can save. Friends, do you want that life? The life you've actually always been longing for but never been able to find. Do you want that life? Real life. Jesus' true life and the life of his eternal Father. Well, friends, you can have it. You can enter into it right now with the promise, the guarantee of experiencing it fully and forever when Jesus returns as Lord at the end of history. You can have this life, and it is simple to do. Just ask him for it as you entrust yourself to him. It's easy. It goes something like this. Jesus, I know you can save. You're generous and kind and loving, and I know that you can and you will give your life to everyone who believes. So please save me. Please give me your life forever. And I entrust myself, my whole life, my joys, my plans, my ways, my future. I entrust it all to you. Friends, that's all it takes. Just trust him. Just ask. And so I'm going to do that now. I'm going to put those exact words into a prayer that you can make your own if you want to give yourself to Jesus and to share in Jesus' life. The words themselves aren't magic. It's the intention that counts. And so if that's what you want, if that's what you intend, will you pray along silently with me now? Let's pray. Lord Jesus, I know you can save. You're generous and kind and loving, and I know that you can and you will give your life to everyone who believes. So please save me. Please give me your life forever. And I entrust myself, my whole life, my joys, my plans, my ways, my future. I entrust it all to you. Amen. Friends, if you happen for the first time in your life to have prayed a prayer like that and asked Jesus to give you his life as you entrust yourself to him, then please come and speak to someone about it. A friend you're here with, a family member, me, Hamish, someone else, so that we can set you on the road to growing in your knowledge and trust of him as you look forward to his return and that glorious experience of a life that is so much more than you can ever imagine. Thanks, Hamish.